The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westfield High. Miss Roberts stood at the front of her English class, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. Her look wasn't just commanding, it had an edge that made the room feel stifling. Each student knew the unwritten rule. Don't cross Miss Roberts. Her authority, woven into her strict demeanor, was a heavy presence in the room. As the last few students shuffled in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Jasmine King, a girl with a quiet but steady presence, stepped into the room, her backpack casually slung over one shoulder. Every eye turned to her, some with curiosity, others with a guarded caution. Miss Roberts noticed too, her expression souring as she watched Jasmine walk toward an empty seat. Well, Miss Roberts said, her voice tinged with a sweetness that felt anything but genuine. It seems we have a new addition to our class. She paused, her gaze icy. I do hope you're able to keep up with our rigorous curriculum. Her emphasis on the word rigorous was unmistakable. Jasmine met the teacher's gaze with calm composure, saying nothing in response. She simply took her seat, her face a mask of quiet resolve. Miss Roberts turned to the board, but the unease in the room lingered. Students exchanged glances, sensing the silent conflict brewing. What happens when a teacher's prejudices collide with a student's quiet resilience? It wouldn't be long before that tension reached a breaking point. Clearing her throat, Miss Roberts announced a lesson. Today, we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. She began, her gaze sweeping across the room, deliberately avoiding Jasmine's hand, which was raised confidently. Miss Roberts called on several other students before finally looking at Jasmine with a tight-lipped smile. Yes, Miss King. Do you have something to contribute? Jasmine straightened in her seat. I believe the novel illustrates systemic racism. She began. Systemic racism? Miss Roberts cut in, her tone dripping with condescension. My dear, I think you're confusing this classic piece of American literature with some modern political agenda. A ripple of unease moved through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others seemed to revel in the brewing tension. Jasmine held her ground, taking a breath. With all due respect, Miss Roberts, the racial injustice in the novel reflects. That's quite enough, Miss Roberts interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than imposing your own interpretations. The dismissal was sharp, and the silence that followed was louder than words. Jasmine's jaw clenched. Her expression stayed composed, but her gaze never wavered from Miss Roberts, and the quiet defiance in her posture was unmistakable. Miss Roberts, unperturbed, turned back to the whiteboard, writing in deliberate, harsh strokes. Now, let's discuss the actual themes the author intended, she said coldly. Who can tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird? She continued, refusing to acknowledge Jasmine's attempts to participate further. It was obvious to everyone. Jasmine's voice wasn't welcome in this classroom, and the students were starting to notice. Some exchanged worried glances, discomfort etched on their faces. A few, however, wore smirks, taking cues from the teacher's behavior and glancing at Jasmine with smug expressions. Jasmine's shoulders tensed, but she stayed focused, taking meticulous notes, a silent but powerful act of resistance against Miss Roberts' attempts to silence her. As the class neared its end, Miss Roberts announced a group project. I'll be assigning the groups myself, she declared. We wouldn't want anyone feeling out of place. The implications hung heavy in the air. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the veiled challenge in Miss Roberts' words. She straightened her shoulders and met the teacher's gaze, her expression steely. The bell rang, dismissing the class. As students filed out, Jasmine gathered her things slowly, each movement deliberate and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Miss Roberts called out, Miss King, a word? Jasmine turned, her expression neutral but poised. Yes, Miss Roberts. Miss Roberts offered a thin smile. I hope you understand that in this class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal agendas or feelings. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your emotions from the curriculum. Jasmine paused, meeting Miss Roberts' gaze with a calm that belied the frustration simmering beneath her composure. I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts, she replied. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Miss Roberts staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty in the teacher's otherwise unyielding expression. In the days that followed, Miss Roberts' initial hesitation solidified into a chilling resolve. She'd show Jasmine exactly who was in charge, regardless of the consequences. This was no ordinary classroom conflict. It was a battle between deeply ingrained prejudice and the quiet resilience of a student who refused to back down. The next week, Jasmine walked into the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever awaited her. Miss Roberts was already at the front of the room, her gaze sharp and unyielding as Jasmine took her seat. The air was thick with tension, like a storm on the verge of breaking. As the lesson began, Miss Roberts' attention seemed to be laser-focused on Jasmine, scrutinizing every movement, every gesture. It wasn't long before she found a target. "Miss King," she snapped, her tone as sharp as broken glass. "Is that gum I see you chewing?" Jasmine, caught off guard, froze mid-motion, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all, but that didn't seem to matter. "No, Miss Roberts." Jasmine tried to explain, but Miss Roberts cut her off. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant." The disdain in her voice was palpable, each word dripping with contempt. Jasmine's classmates shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her gaze, while others watched transfixed, as if witnessing a drama they couldn't look away from. Jasmine slowly rose from her seat, each movement calm and deliberate. She walked to the trash can, miming the act of spitting out the non-existent gum, then returned to her desk. The silence in the room was thick, the tension hanging in the air almost tangible. As the lesson continued, Miss Roberts' behavior grew bolder, each comment more openly critical. She found fault in every detail, from Jasmine's handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss King," she barked at one point, her tone laced with irritation. "This isn't some casual hangout spot." She ignored the fact that Jasmine's posture was no different from the rest of her classmates. Jasmine's frustration was visible in the tight line of her mouth, the clench of her jaw, and the way her fingers curled tightly around her pen. She took deep breaths, fighting to maintain her composure as the teacher's relentless onslaught continued. The classroom dynamics began to shift subtly. Some students, like Sarah in the front row, began casting sympathetic glances at Jasmine whenever Miss Roberts wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's actions, exchanged smirks or whispered comments, feeding off the drama. During a group discussion, Jasmine raised her hand to contribute. Miss Roberts' lips curled into a tight, cold smile. "Yes, Miss King, do enlighten us with your unique perspective," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Miss Roberts interrupted her almost immediately. "I'm sorry. Could you please enunciate more clearly?" she said, her voice carrying an edge. "We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The racism, which had been veiled before, now lay bare in its ugliness. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The classroom was filled with tension, the silent judgment from her peers hanging in the air. The bell rang, ending the class, but Miss Roberts wasn't done yet. "Miss King," she called out, "please stay behind. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding, but her face carefully composed. Miss Roberts looked up at her, eyes cold. "I hope you understand, Miss King, that your attitude is becoming an issue. If you can't meet the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment," she said, her voice laced with barely concealed disdain. Jasmine took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have." As she turned to leave, Miss Roberts called after her, "Oh, and Miss King, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Jasmine nodded, her mind already racing with thoughts. She knew that Miss Roberts would use the presentation as an opportunity to try to undermine her in front of the entire class. Determined not to give her that satisfaction, Jasmine spent countless hours preparing her presentation, determined to deliver with confidence and skill. She wanted to prove to herself and everyone else that she was more than capable, despite the teacher's constant belittling. The project board she prepared was carefully crafted, featuring a well-researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. The day of the presentation arrived, and the tension was almost palpable as Jasmine stepped up to the front of the class. Miss Roberts watched her like a hawk, her pen tapping against her grading sheet with an impatient rhythm. The other students shifted in their seats, sensing that something important was about to happen. Halfway through her presentation, Jasmine paused to answer questions. Miss Roberts' hand shot up immediately. "Miss King," she began, her voice saccharine, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novels?" Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her voice even. "I believe that the themes of racial injustice are central to understanding the novel's message," Miss Roberts. Harper Lee herself stated. "I'm well aware of what the author stated," Miss Roberts interrupted sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. "But I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." Another gasp rippled through the classroom, and the students looked at each other with wide eyes. Jasmine's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to falter. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Roberts," she said, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. "I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Roberts rose from her desk, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the classroom, positioning herself between Jasmine and the rest of the students. "Let me make something very clear, Miss King," she said, her voice low but venomous. "This constant focus on race is not only misguided, but also disruptive to the learning environment." A silence heavier than anything before filled the room, and some students stared down at their desks, unwilling to meet Jasmine's gaze. Miss Roberts continued, her tone cold. "Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable. But here, we expect a higher level of academic rigor." Jasmine stood there, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, but her gaze unwavering. She wasn't just fighting a battle against one teacher's prejudice. She was challenging a deeply ingrained bias, and the quiet strength in her eyes spoke volumes. Others watched, their expressions caught between horror and morbid fascination, as Miss Roberts continued her scathing lecture. Her voice grew louder, resonating with frustration and an air of superiority. "Furthermore, Miss King," she said with emphasis, "your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate, but it also demonstrates a complete lack of understanding of the author's original intentions." She paused, eyes fixed on Jasmine, making her judgment clear. "I'm beginning to wonder if you're even capable of handling the curriculum at this level." Jasmine's eyes filled with tears that she refused to shed. She took a shaky breath, steadying herself before she replied, "Miss Roberts, I respectfully disagree." Her voice was firm, yet controlled. "The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant now as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent. And enough!" Miss Roberts cut her off sharply, her voice laced with impatience. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination, Miss King. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared to meet the academic standards expected in this class." Feeling the weight of embarrassment settling on her shoulders, Jasmine slowly gathered her materials. But before she could fully retreat, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. "But I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good." The words, spoken tentatively, hung in the air. Miss Roberts whirled around, her eyes flashing with indignation. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss King in detention, so we can discuss your academic shortcomings as well." The student shrank back, effectively silenced, and Miss Roberts returned her attention to Jasmine, who was still frozen beside her desk. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Miss Roberts demanded, her tone scathing. "Sit down so we can move on to presentations that are actually worth our time." Jasmine's face burned with humiliation as she sank back into her chair. She felt the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused, each look intensifying her discomfort. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take deep, steady breaths. As Miss Roberts called the next student to present, Jasmine's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue. But what could she possibly do? The teacher held all the authority, and speaking out only seemed to invite more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure it. But a quiet determination began to build within her. This wasn't over. As Jasmine sat in her seat, her mind swirling with thoughts of justice and retribution, an unexpected shift in the air caught her attention. The classroom door opened, and Miss Roberts looked up, a smug smile crossing her lips as she addressed the class. "Class, I have an important announcement," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've decided that it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss King's performance." Jasmine's heart pounded, a mixture of dread and defiance welling up inside her. She knew her father would stand up for her, but the thought of him confronting Miss Roberts made her stomach tighten. The other students exchanged glances, some with worry, others filled with curiosity about what would happen next. Miss Roberts, oblivious to the brewing storm just beyond her classroom walls, continued, "I requested a meeting with Miss King's parents after school today. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and lackluster academic performance." As Miss Roberts's words echoed through the room, a sound broke the silence, the steady, purposeful sound of footsteps in the hallway. Each step grew louder, filling the air with a sense of expectancy. The class seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and a brief pause followed, thick with tension, before a firm knock shattered the silence. Miss Roberts's eyebrows furrowed slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Come in," she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man in a sharp, tailored suit. The instant he entered, his presence commanded attention. A ripple of recognition passed through the students. It was Mr. King, the school principal. Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise, quickly followed by a wave of relief. She glanced over at Miss Roberts, who remained blissfully unaware of the connection between her student and the newcomer. Mr. King stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the students before landing on Jasmine, a flicker of concern in his gaze that only she noticed. He then turned to Miss Roberts, his expression calm but his posture radiating authority. "Miss Roberts," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Miss Roberts straightened, plastering on a professional smile. "Not at all, Mr. King. We were just wrapping up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Mr. King nodded, his eyes now locked onto the teachers. "Actually, there is. I understand you requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Miss Roberts' smile widened, clearly pleased that her authority was being acknowledged. "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's crucial to address certain behavioral issues before they escalate further." "I see," Mr. King replied, his tone unreadable. "And which student might this be?" Miss Roberts gestured dismissively toward Jasmine with a wave of her hand. "Miss King, actually, no relation to you, of course." She chuckled at her own joke, unaware of the tension building in the room. She assumed, based on Mr. King's Chinese-American heritage, that he couldn't be related to her student. Mr. King raised an eyebrow slightly, the only outward indication of his reaction. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone cool. "Well, Miss Roberts, I believe we should discuss this matter further." He paused, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Perhaps in private?" Miss Roberts nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal. "Of course, Mr. King. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Miss King's performance and her attitude." As Miss Roberts gathered her materials, ready to discuss Jasmine's issues in detail, Mr. King turned to address the class. "Students, please continue with your assigned reading. We won't be long." Before turning to leave, he gave Jasmine a brief, reassuring smile, a small but powerful gesture that filled her with a newfound sense of strength. Sitting up straighter, Jasmine felt a surge of confidence that she hadn't experienced in weeks. She had an ally, and for the first time, the power dynamics in the room seemed to shift. "Miss Roberts, still unaware of the true nature of the situation, led the way down the hallway and out of the classroom. Mr. King followed, but as he reached the doorway, he paused. He glanced back at his daughter, and they shared a look filled with silent understanding and shared resilience. The door closed behind them, and a buzz of excited whispers erupted among the students. They leaned across desks, whispering and exchanging theories about what might be happening beyond the door. Jasmine, however, stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on the closed door. She knew that on the other side, her father was about to seek justice on her behalf. The closed door muffled their voices only partially, and soon enough, the rising intensity of their conversation could be heard faintly within the classroom. Miss Roberts's previously confident tone began to falter, breaking into stammering confusion as Mr. King's calm but assertive voice took over. Meanwhile, Miss Roberts led Mr. King to an empty conference room down the hall. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, announcing each step with certainty. She turned to face him, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. King. I've been quite concerned about Jasmine's performance and her attitude in my class." Mr. King's face remained neutral, his expression unreadable. "I see. Please go ahead and tell me more about your concerns." Miss Roberts, assuming his neutrality with support, launched into a detailed list of complaints, her voice growing more animated as she went on. "Well, for starters, Jasmine consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her own perspectives into every discussion, disrupting the structure of the lessons I prepared." As she continued, Mr. King's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue her monologue uninterrupted. "And then there's her attitude," Miss Roberts added, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "She's always disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird that focused solely on racial themes, completely missing the broader literary elements." Mr. King raised an eyebrow, his gaze now firmly fixed on her. "And you believe that addressing racial themes is inappropriate when discussing a novel that revolves around a racially charged trial?" Caught off guard, Miss Roberts faltered for a moment, struggling to respond. "Well, I just believe that we should focus on the universal themes, not get too bogged down by specific social issues." Mr. King's tone remained measured, but his words held an undeniable weight. "I see. And how exactly has Jasmine been disruptive? Could you give me specific examples of her behavior?" Miss Roberts straightened, regaining her previous confidence. "Of course," she said briskly. "She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students. And the way she sits there, so defiant, it's obvious she has no respect for authority." As she spoke, Mr. King's expression subtly shifted, a hint of steely resolve entering his eyes, though his voice remained calm. "Miss Roberts, let me ask you this. Have you considered that what you're perceiving as defiance might actually be a student deeply engaged in critical thinking?" Mr. King nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, Miss Roberts. Jasmine King is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her." Miss Roberts stumbled back slightly, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. She was overwhelmed by the realization of what she had said, the judgment she had made in front of her student's father, and, more importantly, her boss. "Mr. King, I had no idea." She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Mr. King's tone remained even, but there was no mistaking the disappointment and authority in his words. "Clearly, but ignorance does not excuse the behavior you've displayed here today. Not only have you shown clear bias against my daughter, but your comments reveal a troubling pattern of prejudice that extends beyond a single student." Miss Roberts's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. "Mr. King, please. I can explain. I never meant to." Mr. King held up a hand, silencing her. "I think you've said quite enough, Miss Roberts. We'll have a more extensive discussion about this matter later. But for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. The students are waiting." Miss Roberts nodded numbly, turning toward the door. Just as she reached it, Mr. King added, "Oh, and Miss Roberts, I'll be joining your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand Mr. King's tone was calm, but it held a firmness that left no room for misinterpretation. As he followed her back to the classroom, the tension was palpable. When they re-entered, the students straightened in their seats, sensing the charged atmosphere. Mr. King addressed the room with a calm, authoritative voice. "Class, I'll be joining you for today's session. Please continue with your assignments as usual. I believe it's time for an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the real purpose of education," Mr. King began, his voice calm but firm. His words seemed to echo in the silent classroom, and every student's eyes were locked on him. Miss Roberts stood stiffly by her desk, her earlier air of confidence having evaporated completely. Her gaze flickered nervously from Mr. King to Jasmine, struggling to process the intense revelation she'd just experienced. Mr. King continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's come to my attention that there have been several troubling incidents in this class, incidents that go directly against the values our school upholds." The weight of his words filled the room, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some exchanged glances with Jasmine, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place in their minds. Mr. King looked back at Miss Roberts, his expression stern. "Miss Roberts, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it was necessary to undermine and belittle one of your students?" Miss Roberts's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She seemed at a loss, her gaze darting around the room as she struggled to find an answer. "Mr. King, I never meant to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never meant to what, Miss Roberts?" Mr. King's tone rose slightly, and for the first time, there was a crack in his carefully maintained composure. "Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background, never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature simply because they didn't align with your narrow perspective." The students looked on in stunned silence, hardly able to believe that their usually mild-mannered principal was addressing their teacher in this way. Mr. King's words, each one precise and powerful, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering under the surface of this classroom for weeks. "Let me be perfectly clear," Mr. King continued, his eyes fixed on Miss Roberts with an intensity that made her shrink back slightly. "Your behavior toward Jasmine, and likely toward other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. You've fostered an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. This is not the kind of classroom we aspire to have in our school." Miss Roberts tried to interject, her voice trembling. "Mr. King, please. If I could just explain—" "Explain what, exactly?" Mr. King interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Explain how you ridiculed Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes? Explain how you consistently ignored her raised hand during class discussions? Or perhaps you'd like to explain your remark about her lacking prior education because she doesn't fit into your preconceived notions." The color drained from Miss Roberts's face as Mr. King listed her actions, one after another. She glanced around the room, seeking any form of support, but was met only with expressions of shock, disappointment, and in some cases, disgust from her students. Turning back to the class, Mr. King spoke with a renewed sense of purpose. "Students, there's something I want each of you to understand. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. Education should be about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from each other's diverse experiences." He paused, letting his words resonate in the charged silence. "What you've witnessed in this classroom today is not education. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And that ends today." A heavy tension hung in the air as his words sank in. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement, moved by Mr. King's stand. Jasmine sat quietly, visibly moved, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, a mixture of relief and the vindication she had been waiting for. Mr. King's gaze returned to Miss Roberts, who seemed to shrink under his intense scrutiny. "Miss Roberts, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is completely unacceptable and will be addressed through the appropriate channels." He took a breath before continuing. "For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day. Miss Roberts, you may return to your office. We'll discuss the next step soon." Miss Roberts nodded stiffly, her face pale, as she gathered her belongings and left the room, her earlier bravado now replaced by a sense of defeat. The door clicked shut behind her, and a weight seemed to lift from the room. Mr. King turned back to the students, his expression softening. "All right, everyone," he said, his tone gentler now. "I want to assure each of you that this school is a place where your voices matter. Your experiences, perspectives, and thoughts are all valuable here. That is what education is truly about." He took a moment, his eyes meeting Jasmine's, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Now, let's continue our lesson together. Today, we're going to look at literature as a tool for understanding the world around us, a world that is rich in diversity and complex perspectives." The students leaned in, many of them smiling as Mr. King began teaching, filling the room with warmth, respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. This was education as it should be, a place where every student felt heard, valued, and understood. As Ms. Roberts gathered her belongings, her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. She seemed almost dazed, as if the full weight of what had just transpired was finally crashing down on her. She cast a desperate, lingering look around the classroom, her face pale and strained, before hurrying out the door without another word. The silence that filled the room after her departure was thick and palpable. Every student seemed to hold their breath, processing what had just happened. Mr. King took a deep, steadying breath, visibly working to calm himself before addressing the class once more. He moved to the front of the room, his posture relaxed slightly, but still exuding a quiet authority. "I apologize that you all had to witness this today," he said, his tone somber but sincere. "However, I believe it's important for each of you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society." The students listened intently, some looking stunned, others relieved. A few exchanged glances with Jasmine, their silent complicity heavy in the air as they realized the impact of their silence. Mr. King cleared his throat, drawing the class's attention back to him. "I know this has been an intense experience for everyone," he continued, his voice gentle. "We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. I'd encourage each of you to take this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and consider how we can all work together to foster a more inclusive, respectful environment." As the students filed out, many of them paused to offer words of support and encouragement to Jasmine. Sarah, who had always been quiet and reserved, approached Jasmine hesitantly, her face filled with regret. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was afraid." Jasmine gave her a small, understanding smile, nodding gently. "Thank you, Sarah," she replied, her tone warm and forgiving. "Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better. Don't be afraid to use your voice. We all have a part to play." Outside the classroom, word of what had happened spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, discussing the events in hushed tones, piecing together the story as Jasmine and her father walked out into the hallway. Gradually, a ripple of applause began. Just a few students at first, then more, until the hallway was filled with the sound of clapping. Jasmine walked with her head held high, her father by her side. The fear and isolation she had felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment and newfound confidence. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now. They were recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Roberts was beginning to face the full consequences of her actions. The school board was convened for an emergency meeting that very afternoon, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Roberts was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as Jasmine approached the school, she noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles, nodding or waving as she walked by. In the hallways, she overheard snippets of conversations about plans for diversity workshops and the possibility of starting a cultural awareness club. The school was abuzz with a new energy, an energy focused on making positive changes. When Jasmine entered her English classroom, Now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, she was greeted by a sea of welcoming and supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and respect. During lunch, Jasmine found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school a more inclusive space. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to creating mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Jasmine felt truly heard, her voice valued and her experiences respected. After school, as Jasmine walked out with her father, they passed by Ms. Roberts' now empty parking spot. Mr. King placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You know, Jasmine," he said thoughtfully, "what happened here wasn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." Jasmine nodded, her expression serious and reflective. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today," she replied. "There are so many people who face discrimination every day, in and out of school. The events at Westfield High had exposed how prejudice could lurk, even in places meant for learning and growth." Miss Roberts' treatment of Jasmine had revealed biases that had gone unchecked for far too long. But Jasmine's courage to speak up had sparked a transformation within the school community. Students and teachers alike rallied around the goal of creating a more inclusive environment, leading to new initiatives, diversity training, and open dialogues about the importance of understanding and empathy. Jasmine's journey, from feeling like a victim to becoming a leader, demonstrated the power of resilience in the face of adversity. Her willingness to turn pain into positive change inspired her peers and teachers to examine their own beliefs and actions, making a lasting impact that would continue to shape the culture at Westfield High. Through her bravery, she had set a powerful example, reminding everyone that true strength lies in standing up for what's right and in fostering a community where every voice is heard and valued.